Okay, I hope everybody had a good couple of weeks for break. If you remember what we're doing. I'm going to start. Today we are going to deepen our conversation on inequality and how to fix it. And our particular focus is on the relationship between the knowledge economy and inclusion and equality, and how to make progress on that front, explicitly taking into account the features of the knowledge economy, both in the advanced countries and in the middle income countries. So what I want to do is I'm just going to set the stage for this discussion. First, reminding you just some basic facts about the global inequality map, and then talk a little bit about the impact of policy on inequality in the advanced countries, and then just suggest a broad typology about thinking about what are sort of different levels of intervention in the economy to achieve more equitable outcomes. And that will set the stage, and I'll turn over to Roberto. They'll set the stage for a more in-depth discussion that an exchange with me and then with all of you. So, with respect to inequality, it's one of the toughest questions you may have to answer if somebody's asking you the question, what has happened to inequality in the world? It depends on whether you're asking the question in terms of question of inequality within countries, question of inequality in the world at large, that is looking at the whole world as if countries didn't exist, looking at inequality in different parts of the world within countries. You get very different kinds of answers. So just want to set the empirical background straight on many of these things. We'll see that policy and institutions have mapped it a whole lot, introducing the kind of inequality map that the way it has evolved over the last couple of decades. We may come back to this, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, and this is a debate that we keep having with Roberto. Is it lack of ideas, or is it really the lack of a strategy, a political strategy, or the availability of an adequate political strategy to put those ideas into practice that blocks progress on this point? With respect to the specific issues we're discussing today, I think I want to suggest that in fact there are a lot of ideas, many of them generated by economists, and I'll use Anthony Atkinson's book as an example of that. But that really the big questions are really the ones at the very bottom of the slide with respect to what's an appropriate political strategy to dislodge both the narrative about the inability of governments to do much good or to be effective in this domain, as well as to dislodge vested interests that are opposed to reforms in this area. With respect to global inequality, I'm not going to dwell on this a lot. This is a picture that you have seen before. Taking the world as a whole, in fact, global inequality has shrunk. The distribution of income globally is more compact, that it has become tighter, and that's a large part because, as we discussed earlier, rapid economic growth in China and some other low-income and very populous countries. When we turn to within countries, of course, the pattern is often very, very different. And in particular, in the English-speaking countries, there has been a striking increase in inequality, and particularly in the share of income held at the very top. And the left-hand side panel here are those inequality, those English-speaking countries, and the data here go all the way back to the years before World War I. This U-shaped pattern that I'm sure you've already seen a lot. which is that the share of income held by the top 1% has basically went down during the course of the 20th century, reaching its lows in the 1970s, the late 1970s, and then since then has bounced up significantly, at least in the case of the United States, going all the way back up to the levels that of income concentration, especially at the very top, that existed before World War I. But in large part, the picture for the UK, Canada, Ireland, Australia is similar, even if not that accentuated. You look at other advanced countries, the picture actually is quite a bit different. That is that there, sort of this U-shaped relationship, you have an L-shaped relationship, that income inequality has fallen significantly, but that it sort of has remained more or less stable since the late 1970s. So there you don't have this very rapid increase of income concentration at the very top end. There already you see that in fact something must make a difference, that there is something else that's happening in these countries that's preventing this kind of income concentration at the very top that we've seen in the English-speaking countries. So the institutions and the policies that we'll talk about a little bit later make a big difference. What about other countries? In other countries, the pattern is also quite heterogeneous. If you look at sort of what has happened since about 1990 around the world, again, within countries, you can see for the majority of countries as shown here, income inequality has increased. So there's progress towards less equality. The Gini coefficient has become larger. That's a number between 0 and 1 or 0 and 100 that measures how concentrated the distribution of income is. But you also see that at the very top of this chart, you also see some interesting exceptions. In particular, it's quite interesting that in the part of the world where the inequality is the highest, that's the part of the world where inequality, the level of inequality is highest, and that's in fact Latin America, inequality has fallen for the most part. In fact, in almost every country in Latin America, in the last decade or so, 2 decades, inequality has actually fallen. So the ones that you see here are Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, but that is true also of Colombia, it's true of Chile, it's true of Argentina. In all of these countries individually, in fact, inequality has fallen. This is actually maybe news to many of you, and might be a little bit of paradoxical, but also suggests that something else is going on here in the world that interacts with the overall progress. So with respect to Latin America, what is it that we know as to why overall inequality has fallen? 2 things seem to have played a role, starting from the bottom. One is that a mild form of economic populism has actually made a difference. Because the 2000s were the years 2000s and the subsequent decade were in fact the years where a lot of social spending programs, in particular anti-poverty programs, cash grant programs, conditional cash grant programs, were put into effect. And those did have an impact in terms of increasing educational opportunities, in terms of increasing health outcomes, and in terms of the Gini coefficient, actually reducing the Gini coefficient, so that these social transfers have made an impact. But there was a second thing as well, and that's a little bit also at least related to policy, which is that there was a reduction in the so-called skill premium. The skill premium is basically the return to education. And that's really the skill premium. The higher the skill premium, generally the greater the inequality in society, because the more skilled get a higher wage, get a higher income, and that tends to drive the income inequality in society. So when the skill premium increases, as it has, particularly in the United States, since the late 1970s, wage inequality increases, income inequality increases. In Latin America, in the last 2 decades, in fact, the trend has been different. that skill, the return to skill has fallen, and therefore wage inequality has also fallen. That's a bit of a puzzle if you think that, in fact, the kind of technologies we're talking about, that we started to talk about, the new economy 2 weeks ago, are things that are actually complementary to skills in education, that they should increase the return to skill, because people demand more skilled workers in order to put these new technologies into operation. On the other hand, compensating that, there is the fact that if you're able to put more people into school, you have a greater supply of skilled people, and that would tend to reduce the skill premium. So apparently, in Latin America at least, the race between these two forces, increase in the supply of education and increase in the demand for skilled people, the first that reduces the skill premium, the second that increases the skill premium, has been won by the increase in the supply of education. The alternative way to think about it in the context of our discussion earlier about the difference between the vanguard and the rearguard is that there has not been an economy-wide diffusion of these new technologies, the new economy, that has sufficiently increased the demand for skilled labor in Latin America as a whole. So in fact, from that perspective, this decline in the skill premium is bad news. It suggests that there has not been enough diffusion of these technologies within the Latin American economies. Had there been, the skill premium might have in fact increased. So much for Latin America. Obviously, sort of this complex pattern of distributional outcomes is the result of a number of different things. It's the result of technological developments, the nature of technology, that is, as technology increased demand for a particular type of labor. Does this replace labor, as in the case of automation or robots? Is the consequence of the forces of globalization, and in particular, the presence of what's sometimes called winner-take-all markets, that is either through network externalities or because of the globalization of markets. Those who are particularly good can essentially reap the benefits of a very large global market, while those who are only second best essentially get driven out of the market. So the gains tend to be concentrated at the very top, while those who don't win the race end up being losers. Of course, other things have happened here. The deinstitutionalization of labor markets, the decline of trade unions, the decline of regulations, the liberalization of firing and hiring and firing restrictions, the decline in real terms of minimum wages, all of that also have had an impact on the down end of the labor market. And the degree to which that deinstitutionalization has taken place in different countries feeds into these outcomes as to how much inequality there has been. I would also emphasize very sort of different norms about acceptable differences in pay. One thing that has happened is that pay differentials within companies has increased significantly since the 1970s, associated with changing norms about what's an equitable, what's an acceptable distribution of pay within enterprises. Potentially, there are many, many other underlying causes at work as well. But of course, if you're going to think about remedies, then you'll think about that in each one of these areas, and again, potentially more, there are different ways of thinking about it. So that thinking about inequality is not simply going to be about tax policy or about what the government does to redistribute, but goes much more deeply into some of these structural features of the economy. And depending on which one of these factors have played a bigger role, then correspondingly you'll want to think about reforms in each one of these areas in greater detail. But let's look at sort of the first thing that people think about when they think about government policies on inequality, which is what the government does to redistribute directly. So in terms of course, as I was just indicating, as I'll come back to, the government does a lot of things to redistribute, even when it's not directly called redistributive policy. But the things that sort of immediately we associate with redistributive policies are policies of taxing and transferring, right? So you tax incomes at the very high end, and then you provide public benefits or social benefits to poor families, health insurance benefits, unemployment benefits, all kinds of transfers. And those are sort of transfers through which you increase the actual incomes of households who might be earning very little or who are excluded from labor markets. So therefore, you can actually, to see the impact, how much impact these directly redistributive government policies have been, we can look at, in each one of these societies, at what the distribution of income is before the government, so to speak, steps in to redistribute income explicitly in this fashion. So let's call that initial distribution, which is shown here with the red bar, is the market income. It's the income distribution that you get sort of just from sort of the market. Okay, of course, the market itself, as I'll indicate in a second, is shaped by a whole bunch of other institutions and government policies that we don't want to discount, but we're focusing only on what happens when the government comes in after the so-called market has done its job. So the red bar is the level of market income inequality, and that, as I said, is a number that goes from 0 to 1. Okay, so if you look at the United States, where the red bar here stands for 0.51. That's a Gini coefficient of 0.51. That's the inequality that the market generates. Then you can look at the inequality in actual disposable income, the actual income people have, and what's the difference between disposable income and market income. The difference is precisely what the government does. That is to tax and take money income away from some of the high earners and redistribute it to some of the low earners. So we have another inequality measure, that is the inequality in disposable income, and that's the blue bar. Okay, so the blue bar in the case of the United States is actually 0.39. So the difference between 0.51 and 0.39 is the effect of redistribution, explicit redistribution through the tax transfer program. You can see that even in the case of the United States, this is a fairly large number. Even in the United States, a lot of it is happening. It's also interesting to look at some of these other cases. So of the OECD countries included here, developing countries, the two developing countries at the very top, Chile and Mexico, two Latin American countries. I've already told you Latin America is the part of the world where the level of income inequality is the highest. There you see that, in fact, there's a relatively small amount of redistribution that is happening, that is taking place through the government budget. Okay, the red and the blue bars are relatively close to each other. And then you go down the line, so at the very bottom are the countries that have the greatest amount of equality. And it's interesting that the ranking of countries by actual inequality in disposable income is actually quite different than the ranking of countries according to market income. Okay? Compare, for example, Ireland. Ireland has the highest inequality in terms of market income here. Market Gini is 0.58. But by the time the government has redistributed, Ireland Gini falls down to 0.31. Or compare maybe more relevant comparison. Compare two advanced industrial countries, United States and Germany. You see Germany there somewhere in the middle, towards the bottom. Germany's market income is 0.51, exactly the same as the United States. So the difference between Germany and the United States is not that the operation of markets in these two countries is producing different levels of inequality. It's just that the German state is doing a whole lot more redistribution through its tax and transfer scheme than in the case of Germany. The actual disposable income Gini goes all the way to 0.29 compared to 0.39 in the United States.
Just a clarification question. The red bar does not consider policies that might affect distributions, for example, minimum wage.
Yes.
It's just considered tax.
This is purely the redistribution that happens through the budget. Okay, so that's important again. So it's only part of what the government is doing. Now, of course, a lot of what the government is doing elsewhere is not necessarily may be redistributing in the wrong direction too. We don't know that. You have to look at that. So the point about this is just the role of the government in all of these societies, particularly the advanced societies, not so much developing countries, in terms of the tax and transfer, is huge and makes a huge amount of difference to actual inequality in societies. That this is very different, even across different kinds of advanced countries. Okay? But just to hark back to the last point that we made, when Marco raised the question again, is that we should not think of sort of, the only domain where government acts, where it has some leverage, and where it affects the distribution, is only what it does through the budget, only what it does through its tax policies and through its transfers. So in here, particularly with respect to when we're discussing the knowledge economy, the new technologies, innovation, and so on, we're going to be interested in a lot more than simply these tax and transfer policies. We're interested in precisely on sort of the broad gamut of governments, innovation, social, labor policies can impact overall market inequality, and therefore sort of think about those interventions on a much broader, more structural kind of a scale. So here's one way to sort of to think about, at least to categorize those different kinds of policies that I find helpful and you might find helpful. So first, let's think about sort of how the economy operates, and think about this as a kind of a series of steps. So starting from the very top, so basically we have people come into markets, individuals, workers, households come into markets, bringing what they have on their own. Okay, what is it that they have on their own? Is the education they have, the skills that they've acquired, the experience they have. Okay, they bring their savings, their capital, their access to finance, their endowments, in other words. So you can think about endowments both in terms of how much educational endowment they have, how much capital endowment they have. So this is what each individual is bringing to the market. And of course, they bring in also they're a member of a society. They have their networks. They have their social capital. They have their social endowment. So they also bring those when they come to the market, in some sense, before any of the production starts. In the second stage, that's where the production stage takes place. That's where the supply side of the economy gets into gear. The supply side of the economy takes these endowments, the entrepreneurship, the education, the skills, the training, the capital, and then puts them together. And there's a big black box out there, right? That we're very interested in terms of figuring out how that operates. But what you're going to get is you're going to get investment in productivity, innovation, research and development, all the bases of the generation of the knowledge economy. You'll get production, you'll get exchange, you'll get essentially the economy operate. And then from there, what do you get? You get what the market produces, the outcomes. It's the third box here. You get wages being paid, salaries being paid, profits being earned, rents being generated. Right? That comes out. And then finally, the very final box, however, is, because the government is going to then intervene in terms of redistributing even after that stage, then you actually have the disposable income. You get the wealth and income distribution ultimately that's going to show up in the actual Gini. So there's all kinds of different levels in which you can think about where we're acting. Right? You can imagine that you're acting at the very first level of this process. That is that before people step in, so to speak, into the production investment nexus, that you can affect the endowments that they have. What is it that they have that they bring? Their capabilities. Okay? And the kinds of policies, and this is not going to be obviously exhaustive, but you can think of the policies with respect to what kind of education, what kind of schools, what kind of training. Do people have access to a universal income? Right? Do they come with minimal capital endowments? on which they can draw on, which perhaps the state holds for them in the form of sovereign wealth fund? Do they have access to savings on which they're drawing a guaranteed or otherwise return? And what kind of spatial and regional policies are pre-existing that determine what kind of services these individuals have access to, what kind of networks are they part of? In some sense, you can think of the whole range of these policies, therefore, that are affecting the capabilities, the physical, social capital, and the skills and educational endowment of these individuals as they join the production and investment innovation process. Then there are a whole range of policies that actually affect how that production, how the markets are directly going to operate. Because the markets are not going to operate simply just on their own without any kind of institutional support, and we've talked about these as the institutional bases of how the market operates, and we've kept on stressing that sort of market is not just something that just takes one natural form. It always is backed and supported and complemented by a number of institutional arrangements. And these can be everything from sort of how much is the state actually engaged in direct partnership with the private sector, in structural transformation policies, in industrial policies to promote innovation, to promote diffusion, to promote inclusion, right? Industrial policies, the kind of macroeconomic management of the economy that might or might not create high levels of demand for labor and therefore maintain wages that are relatively high. So we'll come to macroeconomic policies, I think, next week. The range of labor market policies, labor standards, so minimum wage, for example, was the question that Marco asked. Yes, so the minimum wage is going to be here. So if the government has minimum wage policies, that's directly going to affect choices that people make, both as suppliers of labor and on the other side, employees and enterprises as demanders of labor, and therefore affects these policies. The government have employment guarantees, right? So employment guarantee, the government might provide employment guarantee that ensures everybody has some kind of a job. If they don't get a job in the private sector, they might get a job in the public sector at a guaranteed wage. That's going to directly affect the opportunities that people have, but also is going to have implications for how the private markets operate, because that's going to be a backstop to what the private sector can do. Okay? And of course, this is then the third level, the level that we just looked at in the context of the previous chart, which is that after the market, so to speak, does its magic, then at that level, the government can come in and redistribute through taxes and through its transfer policies. But there are all these three levels at which there's a very large range of things that are possible. And we are particularly interested in things that move away from the standard remedy of taxes and transfers. We're interested in policies at this level, and we're interested in policies at that level, okay? Particularly as they are relevant in the context of the knowledge economy. Now, I want to end just with a quick reminder of what's in the Atkinson book. Tony Atkinson is a very distinguished public finance economist who also did some pioneering work on income inequality, pioneered a number of papers with Thomas Piketty. Unfortunately, passed away, I believe, last year. And you read a chapter, but I realized that actually the chapter you read actually starts sort of in the middle of his proposals. I think it starts with proposal 6. Nobody complained and said, can we read the previous chapter? Maybe I did that because the chapter was already so long. But I wanted to sort of quickly lay out his full agenda, not because I believe each one of these is something that universally should be applied, but I think it sort of lays out, I think, what the lay of the land in terms of where sort of where economists are in terms of the range of things that they're actually thinking about. Okay. Now, each one of these operate at different levels in terms of my previous typology. But some of the things that I particularly want to emphasize, and in fact, depart significantly from a lot of economic thinking to date. For example, is proposal number 1, that economists have had a tendency to think about, and this goes back to our discussion of 2 weeks ago, think of technology as a kind of an autonomous force. So they say technology is a bias towards skill. So they say that today's technological change is skill biased. Means that when technology comes into play, there's a disproportionate amount of demand that's created for skills. And that's good for skilled workers because there's a lot of demand for them. But it's not very good if you're unskilled. Okay? So the point that Tony Atkinson's make is that actually, the nature, the direction of technological change, whether it's skill bias, unskilled bias, whether it complements labor, whether it complements machines, has a lot to do with the overall context. And governments, actually, public policy can affect the nature or the direction of technological change. And he explicitly suggests that in environments where there is inequality and not enough high-paying jobs are being created, that it's perfectly reasonable and desirable for governments to actually intervene, so to speak, in the direction of technological change to emphasize and to prioritize technological change that increases the employability of workers and it emphasizes the human dimension of service provision, as he calls it. So put, for example, subsidize, because the government is always doing infrastructure, tax incentive, R&D subsidies, there's always intellectual property rights. There's always doing things that is having an impact on technology. Emphasize those areas that actually create jobs. Don't emphasize, for example, don't subsidize, to take an obvious example, driverless cars, which is directly going to reduce the demand for labor. Instead, for example, emphasize labor-saving technologies in the home that might make it easier for low-income earners to actually participate in the labor market. That actually helps them in such a way. So I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but I just wanted to lay them up. They're going to be in my slides, and I think this has a feel more like a feel of a catalog, but I think it's a sort of a good starting point for an overall discussion. So there's the 6 through 10, I believe you would have, was those that were actually reading. 5 through 10, yes. 5 through 10 were the in your readings, and then there is another 5 of them here. But I'm just going to leave it here. Going back to one of the points I started out with, which is the idea that I don't want to emphasize how sort of fertile the discussion is. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate the fertility of the discussion in terms of how much all these remedies floating around, but I think it would be wrong to say that there aren't a lot of good ideas about what can be done, including institutional reforms, and that to me it seems like the main area where we have difficulty making progress is actually understanding the underlying political economy of why is it that bad ideas still are around, or vested interests somehow can still not be dislodged. So, if you have any questions directly on what I've said, then you just take those, and then let's move on to, yeah.
Why do economists care so much about inequality? What is it indicative of with this?
Why do economists care so much about inequality? I guess maybe economists want to be human too. Hard, but there's a, that's the snide answer. But I mean, let me restate that, is to say that even economists understand that there are aspects of society where sort of extremes of inequality may be unproductive and may create social dysfunction. Okay, so even if it's not necessarily. So you didn't say it, but presumably in the back of your mind is the notion that it's understandable maybe we care about poverty and that you want to take care of poverty, but why care about inequality? From a broader perspective, there's the notion that inequality might reflect some basic differences in inequality of opportunity, unfairness in the underlying rules of the game, that might in turn then sort of reduce the legitimacy of the system and cause the kind of populist reaction that we might be having. So that would be a kind of a set of arguments about why intrinsically inequality is bad. But economists also have a bunch of utilitarian arguments. That is, that arguments about why inequality might be bad because it's going to cause markets not to function well because unequal societies may not be growing rapidly. For example, one argument might be that inequality is a reflection of the fact that too many people at the bottom rungs of the income distribution don't have access to productive opportunities, but they may be the future Einsteins, they may be the future innovators, they may be the future entrepreneurs, and therefore by depriving them of such opportunities, leaving aside the question of that's not morally and ethically the right thing to do, that it might sort of backfire in terms of producing negative economic outcomes. At the back.
Yeah, so I think from what I remember from Thomas Piketty's book, he focused a lot on capital, and it seems like a lot of inequality that we feel today, regardless of the Gini coefficients, it's not really, I'm not sure if it's really about the income difference, but the fact that certain people have started with a vastly more prosperous sort of set of capital, and a lot of that has to do with imperialism in the past and colonization that allowed for this kind of accumulation of capital that began sort of the capitalist economy. So could you, so for example, even if you do fix the income inequality, the difference in capital might, keep rent payers as rent payers and landlords as landlords, which creates a difference in the wealth. And I feel like, could you comment on that part of the inequality as well?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what was new with Piketty's work is that he brought somehow capital back into the picture. That it wasn't that there was not enough focus on inequality because people had obviously noticed that the Gini was rising, that inequality was rising, but almost without exception, the empirical work and the economics work discipline was on wage inequality. That's really was the lens through which inequality was being looked at, and then and Piketty said, look, there's this other aspect which not only is quantitatively important, but has this very unstable dynamic that portends very, very poorly for the future. Now, I would say it's an empirical issue. So, there's, without question, there's wage inequality is also a big part of the picture, as well as the inequality of asset ownership and capital ownership. And different countries are going to have different sort of weights on whether it's one or the other. That's quantitatively the more important one. But it's clear that there are different forces at work in explaining these sort of wage inequality is affected obviously much more by labor market developments, labor market institutions, and differences in skills and education. Whereas obviously, as you mentioned, inequality in capital and capital returns has a lot to do with inheritance and initial conditions, and to the extent that that's quantitatively very important, then the remedies are going to operate at a somewhat very different level. Yeah.
I want to comment about Atkinson proposals. Thank God they are the first four, because when you read 5 to 10, it seems a little bit out of context. when we look at the knowledge economy, it's not a matter of economy. It's a matter of culture. Like
It's a matter of
culture.
culture.
Yes, to compete and collaborate simultaneously, or to work in teams, and in a way that you could have an economical effect of beating the law of diminishing returns. But it's a matter of culture that has been made. In Russia, some of the Russian Jews, which came to America, established Google, and came to Tel Aviv, established a small Silicon Valley. In Russia, they couldn't do it because it's a matter of culture. So, if we look at Tony Atkinson's proposals, there's a big chunk missing in a way that doesn't really comprehend and grasp the knowledge economy, because it's not an economical phenomenon. It's another phenomenon. It's a human phenomenon, if we can look at it, and it's very problematic to look at it in that perspective, in my point of view.
Let me just make two quick comments. I mean, one is, to be fair to Tony Atkinson, he is not concerned in this book about the knowledge economy per se, even though it's obviously a big part of the background conditions to which he must address his remedies to. But whether it's cultural, human, whether it's an economic relationship. I mean, I think what you're saying can be put in a rather different terms. That I might say that what you're saying is exactly the importance of the institutions that underpin an economy. That the reason that the Russian Jews can be entrepreneurial and can be so much more productive in the United States context is because there's an ecosystem that enables, with all the venture capital, with concentration of other innovative firms on which they can grow, a skilled labor pool, an intellectual property right regime, and a government that is not essentially allows people to do what they want without fear of expropriation. That is not to say that that's the only kind of context that allows such entrepreneurship and innovation to thrive. In fact, I would give the example of Israel is a somewhat different mix, where in fact a lot of the innovation has been directly produced by the state, because the state has been so single-mindedly focused on having very strong defense. And with that has come a certain single-minded focus on developing defense industries, the most advanced defense industries, from which there has been a whole bunch of spillovers into the private sector in terms of new technology. So that's a very different model, where it's been directed by the state with a single-minded focus to mobilize resources in a particular direction. Yes, the market obviously plays a role, because people do this because there's a return, but that the single-minded focus of the Israeli government to develop these technologies and provide the overall infrastructure, fund the education, develop the talent pool and so forth has made a huge impact. So this might be an alternative model for smaller countries which are trying to, in some sense, leapfrog a kind of national mobilization strategy, which I think would not be very different from some of the things that we might talk about later. Let me just take one more question and then move on. Yeah.
It's a quick question. So when you show the graph showing the Gini function before and after taxes and transfers, you mentioned that the market itself divided both Germany and the US, for example, to the same place quality-wise. I would expect there's still some hidden differences in the regulation in different stages that actually facilitate, for example, for Germany to do more redistribution afterwards, for example, higher taxes. So my question is whether market leads to similar levels of inequality led by itself or whatever the regulations are, but does these underlying regulations also lead to similar levels of growth?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question about whether, whether either the regulations that affect the production stage or the tax and transfer schemes that come into play after the production stage, whether those in turn have determinate implications for economic dynamism and economic growth. And the general answer to that is that it doesn't seem to be the case, that there is no determinate relationship between the variation in overall tax rates, variations in the level of redistribution, and the nature of product and labor market regulations within the range of the variation we observe today, Germany versus the United States, UK versus France, that seem to directly have predictable and ambiguous effects on the level of innovation, the rate of productivity growth, the rate of overall economic growth. So this, goes somewhere somewhat at variance with a kind of a simple, if you will, neoliberal or market fundamentalist notion that you have to pay a price in terms of growth if you're intervening more in market, if there are more taxes. That overall, even though there's periodic attempts by international organizations and certain economists to demonstrate to the contrary, that the overwhelming, or my reading of the evidence is that in fact there is no such effect. So I think that if you want, that is not to say that, it's not to say two things. One is, it's not to say that if you go outside the range of what we observe today, that there wouldn't be. Obviously, that, remember the Laffer curve, the notion that, that there is an inverse relationship after a certain point between the tax rate and the revenue. I mean, the two ends of the Laffer curve do make sense. That is, that if tax is 100%, basically, you're really going to reduce the incentive to engage in entrepreneurship and innovation, right? Then you really have to rely only on the cooperative public spirit of people simply to do things for its own good. And you remove the incentive to do it for enrichment. And we think, for good or ill, that the enrichment motive is still fairly important. So point number one is that, doesn't mean that if you take these policies to the extreme, or that if you have hiring and firing restrictions that are extremely tightly binding, that they're not going to have effect on entrepreneurial or firm dynamism. It's just that within the range of what we have currently, there doesn't seem to be very strong effect. And the second thing is that these are broad aggregate correlations. That is, within certain clusters, within certain industries, that they might have microeconomic effects, and they do. And so, so therefore there are reasons to be concerned with the incentive effects of different regulations or different tax policies, but at the right level at which to look for these things are really at a rather disaggregated industry or for the firm level, rather than at a very broad level. Will innovation in Sweden suffer because the Swedish government transfers 50% of its GDP, which is, you think about this, Sweden is, 60% of the government, GDP is government, you might say, Sweden must be really backwater right now. In fact, it's one of the most innovative countries that we have. Okay, so let me just stop here. Okay.
So we have a double theme in this class. The first theme is the general exploration of economic inequality, and the second theme is the achievement of an inclusive form of the knowledge economy as an example of structural change in the service of the overcoming of extreme inequality. I therefore divide my remarks into two parts. In the first part, general comments about economic inequality, and in the second part, the inclusive knowledge economy as an example of what will be my main thesis about economic inequality. Economic inequality. The predominant basis for thinking about economic inequality, not just in the rich North Atlantic region, but also in the whole world, has been institutionally conservative social democracy. The social democratic settlement was achieved in the middle of the past century, in the aftermath of the Second World War, was the last major moment of institutional and ideological refoundation in the advanced societies. The central idea with respect to inequality is this. The market, meaning the market as it is now organized, is the growth machine. Unfortunately, the market generates inequalities. These inequalities can and should be corrected after the fact through compensatory and retrospective redistribution by tax and transfer. That is to say, by progressive taxation and by redistributive social entitlements. Thus, the whole focus of institutionally conservative social democracy falls on the correction of the inequalities generated by the present market order, rather than on the renovation of the institutional arrangements that shape that present order. There is then a problem. The problem is that any attempt to extend or to radicalize this corrective redistribution by tax and transfer threatens to disturb and derange the economic incentives, or to subvert the economic arrangements of the present market regime, and thus to exact an unacceptable cost in economic efficiency and growth. And this tension between the requirements of efficiency and growth on the one hand, and the impulse toward corrective redistribution on the other hand, is captured in the familiar rhetoric about a tension between efficiency and equity. The allusion to that tension it simply means that the present market regime is taken as given, and that the way to achieve greater equality is to correct its outcomes after the fact, rather than to change what the market order is. Now, the established social democracies, in particular the European social democracies, have to some extent mitigated this tension in two ways. The first way, on which I will comment later, is their heavy reliance on the indirect and regressive taxation of consumption to fund a high level of redistributive social entitlements. And the second way in which they have mitigated the tension is that they have placed a very great emphasis in the entitlements programs on entitlements that consist in investments in people and in their capabilities, especially in the form of public education and public health. There is a fundamental distinction between the arrangements shaping what you could call the primary distribution of economic advantage and the policies that attempt to achieve a corrected secondary distribution of economic advantage by progressive taxation and social entitlements. And institutionally conservative social democracy, while chiefly emphasizing the secondary distribution, has moderated this contrast in the two ways I just mentioned. So it's a baffling outcome. The central concern of social democracy has been the humanization of the market order, but the self-denying ordinance by which it has attempted to achieve this goal which is to leave the market regime alone and then to correct its inequalities after the fact, drastically limits how far it can go in the achievement of its own professed goal. The crucial analytical premise underlying this established way of thinking is the idea that there are basically only two things that we can do with a market. We can regulate it, or we can moderate its inequalities after the fact through corrective redistribution. What we cannot do on this way of thinking is to change the constitutive arrangements of the market order itself. And that, I want to argue, is what we must chiefly do. That is what matters most. I then state dogmatically, in the hope of an opportunity to discuss later, three propositions that together summarize a way of thinking about economic inequality beyond institutionally conservative social democracy. And these propositions are hierarchically ordered. So the first and most important proposition is that what matters most is everything that has to do with the institutional arrangements that shape the primary distribution of advantage. By organizing economic and educational access. And we can distinguish broadly two main categories of such institutional innovations. The first category could be placed under the label of states. So, for example, the state has a public investment facility or a sovereign wealth fund, and it then gives every citizen of the country a stake, an equity stake, in the productive apparatus of the economy. The second major category is the category of opportunities and capabilities. We reorganize the market economy in some way, and I want to give examples later, to expand educational and economic opportunity in a way that results in a transformation, in an equalizing transformation of the primary distribution of economic advantage. The second category, the category of opportunities and capabilities, is more fundamental than the first category of states because its effects are likely to be more far-reaching and also because it is likely to require more consequential change in the institutional arrangements. The whole significance of states is very different depending on whether it is a substitute for institutional innovation addressed to opportunities or capabilities, or it is a complement to such innovation. Now I come to my second proposition. To affirm that the primary distribution is much more important than the secondary distribution is not to deny that corrective redistribution has no legitimate role. It has an important and even indispensable but accessory role. With respect to secondary distribution, however, there are two sides. One side is the progressive character of the tax system, that is the budget of the state on the revenue-raising side, and the other side is the nature of public spending and its level. Now, the proposition that I want to advance is the following, and I start with an apparent enigma. On paper, in some respects, within the rich North Atlantic democracies, the most progressive tax system is the tax system of the United States, for the simple reason that it relies heavily on the progressive taxation of personal income. By contrast, the European social democracies rely primarily on the avowedly regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax, or on some functional equivalent to it, as for example in France, a crazy quilt of consumption taxes. Now, how are we to understand this enigma? The explanation seems to be the following. In the short term, what matters most to the redistributive effect, this corrective redistribution, is not how progressive the taxation is on the revenue-raising side of the budget, but what the aggregate level of the tax take is and how it is spent. So the fundamental reason why the European systems of corrective redistribution go further and are more effective is very simple. It's that the European social democracies take in at least 10% more of GDP than the United States as tax, and then they spend the public revenue redistributively. Everything that is lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the budget is gained in double on the spending side. The regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the VAT, makes it possible to maximize the tax take while minimizing the disturbance to economic arrangements and incentives to save, invest, and employ. And that must be so, even in principle, because the VAT is designed as a system, as a tax that is neutral with respect to relative prices. It takes a constant portion of every transformation of an input into an output. Now we come to the third proposition in this hierarchy of propositions. The third proposition is that, nevertheless, the progressive taxation may have a role, and we have to think clearly what role it can have. It has two main targets. The first and primary target is the hierarchy of standards of living. And the second target is the accumulation of economic power. Now, the best way to hit the hierarchy of standards of living is not the income tax, which is a confused and relatively ineffective instrument, but an individualized tax on consumption. Taxing on a steeply progressive slope the difference between total income, including returns to capital, as well as to labor, of the individual, and what the individual saves and invests. And that difference is what he spends on himself and on his standards of living. So at the lowest level, instead of paying anything he might receive, the negative income tax, the minimum guaranteed income, then in the middle, he would be taxed on a progressive slope. And at the top, the marginal rate might be as high as political power and will makes possible. In this tax, 100% is not the top marginal rate. The sky's the limit. Beyond a certain level of luxury living, for every dollar the individual spends on himself, he might have to pay for it to the state. Now, one might think that if the progressives were clear-sighted and sincere about their commitments to redistribution to the tax system, that is the tax that they would prefer. But in general, they seem to prefer progressive pieties to transformative effects. The other object of progressive taxation, the accumulation of economic power, is much harder to hit through the tax system as opposed to economic reorganization. A wealth tax is hard to advance and to radicalize in these economies without massive economic disorganization. And The most accessible form of the tax on wealth is the tax on the hereditary transmission of property or anticipated transmission in the form of gifts inter vivos. Now I come to the second part of my remarks on the knowledge economy and its dissemination as an instance of structural change influencing the primary distribution of economic advantage. It's not the only such instance. There are many instances. I simply signal another one of great importance, which I hope we will have occasion to discuss later in the course. And that is the relation between labor and capital, especially with respect to the now major problem of precarious employment. So the knowledge economy. Going back to our discussion of 2 weeks ago, the most advanced practice of production, the one that holds the promise of endogenous and continuous rather than external and discontinuous innovation, is now confined to fringes in each sector of the economy, fringes that exclude the vast majority of workers and firms. If we could organize a dissemination of the knowledge economy throughout the production system, we would have created a formidable mechanism of both economic growth and inclusion and equality. We would no longer be caught in this tension between equity and efficiency. We would place growth or growth in productivity on the same side as greater equality and inclusion. Remember the dilemma of development that we discussed. Conventional industrialization, meaning Fordist mass production, has ceased to be a reliable route to economic growth. But the alternative, which is an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, seems to be inaccessible. The only way to break this dilemma is to make the inaccessible accessible. And to make the inaccessible accessible, we have to break it into pieces and stages. That is then the point of the sketch of an argument that I now present about the requirements for the economy-wide dissemination of the knowledge economy and the conditions in politics and in culture that make it more or less likely that we will be able to satisfy these requirements. So first, there are educational cognitive requirements. Classical development economics paid only lip service to education. Now it's really necessary. And what kind of education does the knowledge economy require? It requires an education with the following 4 attributes. First, it must accord priority to the acquisition of analytic and synthetic capabilities over the mastery of information. Second, because these capabilities are not acquired in a vacuum of content, with respect to content, it must prefer selective depth to encyclopedic coverage. Third, it must, in its social setting, prefer cooperation among students, among teachers, between teachers and students, among schools, to the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism. And fourth, it must be dialectical in its approach to the received body of knowledge. Every subject must be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. The national curriculums that exist in the world are a kind of infantilization of the orthodoxies of the university culture. They naturalize the marriage of method to subject matter. For example, economics, as we discussed, is not the study of the economy, but the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians. And They induce the young to mistake the dominant ideas for the way things are and emasculate them, delivering them to the higher stages of education prepared for a life of intellectual servility. We would want basic education to be more profound than university education and to immunize the young against this surrender. This is a program not just for general education, but for vocational education, which would cease to focus on job-specific and machine-specific skills, but would instead prioritize the generic higher-order capabilities that are required for the use of numerically controlled machine tools. It can only be achieved in a institutional and financial context that reconciles in large and unequal societies the local management of the schools with national standards of investment and quality. The second set of requirements are the social moral requirements. To deepen and spread, the knowledge economy demands an elevation of the level of trust and discretion and a fluid mixture of cooperation and competition. Now we are often tempted to treat the accumulation of social capital and the disposition to cooperate as if it were just a brute fact about culture. But in fact, it responds to initiatives and innovations. And let me just give you some examples. So one example is the cooperative character of education that I just mentioned. People learn to cooperate early on. A second example is the engagement of civil society cooperatively, together with the state, in partnership with the state, in the provision of public services. And a third example is the generalization of a principle of mandatory social service in society, so that every able-bodied adult have the obligation at some part of his life or in some part of the working year to help take care of other people outside the boundaries of his own family. The third set of requirements are the legal institutional requirements. And here again, the central premise is that the market order has no single natural and necessary form. We can imagine stages or steps, and let me distinguish three such stages. In the first accessible, moderate stage, the focus is on broadening and organizing access to the crucial resources of capital, technology, advanced practice, and advanced knowledge in favor of a much broader constituency of firms, especially small and medium-sized firms. And above all, organizing or coordinating these different forms of access as private venture capital does in its own narrow domain. Moreover, at this initial stage, it's vital to discover what works experimentally and then to disseminate the successful experiments. At the second stage, we would have the emergence of an alternative institutional architecture of the market economy on two axes. The vertical axis of the relation between government and firms, and the horizontal axis of the relations among firms. On the vertical axis, we would say we can't accept the choice between the two models of government-business relations now on offer in the world. The American model of arm's-length regulation of business by government, and the Northeast Asian model, a formulation of unitary trade and industrial policy imposed top-down by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. We would need a third model of decentralized strategic coordination, in which the crucial agents would be independent support centers, intermediate between the state and the firms, professionally staffed, and under competitive pressure. So rather than there being one industrial policy, there would be many. And on the horizontal axis of the relations among firms, the promotion of cooperative competition. These firms would continue to compete against one another, but at the same time cooperate, pooling resources to achieve economies of scale. And the third stage of this legal and institutional evolution would then involve the construction over time of alternative regimes of contract and property that would coexist experimentally within the same market order. In other words, there isn't a single dogmatic exclusive way of decentralizing access to productive resources and opportunities. Traditional unified private property is good for some things, but not good for everything. So it's good because it allows an entrepreneur to do things in which no one else believes. But in other parts of the production system, we might want to make possible the coexistence of claims on the same productive resources by many different tiers of right holders. Workers, local communities, local governments, as well as investors, and thus organize a system of disaggregated, temporary, or conditional property rights. This is a radicalization of the market idea. The market idea ceases to be pinned to a single version of itself. Now then we can ask, under what conditions in culture and in politics does it become more likely that these three sets of requirements, the educational requirements, the social moral requirements, and the legal institutional requirements can be met? In culture, the fundamental condition is the radicalization of an experimentalist impulse in every department of social life. And imagine, by way of example, some of the initiatives that would contribute to that end. So first, the dialectical character of education. Second, the organization of facilities for people to change careers in midlife. Third, the activity of the state to promote experimentation by the young. For example, take a small and rich country like Norway. It has a sovereign wealth fund. It uses its fund as a kind of public venture capitalist to finance the young to go all over the world and establish businesses or philanthropic activities, and then come back home and shake things up on the principle that no one should be condemned to live a small life by the sole fact of having been born in a small country. And all of these initiatives would in turn be more likely to be fertile against the background of economic security, a fundamental stake or minimum income that encouraged everyone to experiment and to risk. Now the political conditions. The political condition for the satisfaction of these three sets of requirements is the development over time of a high-energy democracy. By which I mean a democracy that is able to engage the structure and that does not need crisis in the form of economic ruin or war as the condition of change. So there are three sets of crucial innovations in the construction of such a high-energy democracy. The first are arrangements that elevate the temperature of politics, the level of organized political engagement in public life, the electoral regimes, the financing of politics, the access to the means of mass communication. The second are innovations that hasten the pace of politics, resolving impasse quickly, for example, through anticipated elections or comprehensive programmatic plebiscites. And the third is the ability to combine in the organization of federal systems or in the combination of a central state with radical devolution, strong central initiative with the ability of parts of the society to deviate from the predominant solutions and create counter models of the national future. In other words, it is the political radicalization of the experimentalist impulse. We need structural alternatives, but we do not want to succumb to a structural dogmatism. We must discover the way along the way. Now, what I have just outlined in this example of structural change influencing the primary distribution of economic advantage is not a system. So at first the impression may be that this is too high a mountain to climb, or that this is there on a take it or leave it basis. It's not like that. It should be understood under the aegis of a principle of combined and uneven development. All the parts of this direction that I've outlined are connected. But the characteristic way of advancing is that we advance on one front or on some fronts before we advance on others. Then we hit against a limit imposed by our failure to advance on other fronts, and then we turn to the other fronts. And thus, if we have the requisite combination of patience and impatience, and arm ourselves with superior insight, we can use fragmentary and gradual means to achieve revolutionary results.
How do we reconcile this idea of a state that's innovating in all different parts with centralized moral rules that we want to have? So if we had all these different groups innovating, wouldn't we have some that would tend towards something that wasn't even us at all, that might go towards more? You mean
you're addressing specifically when I spoke about politics, this idea of counter models of the national future?
Exactly.
So it's of course a very syncopated discussion. So the traditional way of thinking is dominated by a series of supposed inescapable contradictions. For example, with respect to what I call the temperature of politics, which is the level of political engagement, of popular engagement in political life, we tend to think that politics must be either institutional and cold or hot and anti-institutional. That's Caesarism. But in fact, politics can be both institutional and hot. That is, different sets of arrangements can differ in the degree to which they sustain a high level of engagement, of mass engagement in political life. Now, similarly, with respect to the relation between the center and the periphery, the conventional view is that there's an inverse relation. Either power goes to the center or power goes to the periphery. Everything that one gains, the other loses. But this is false, because we can hope to create arrangements that simultaneously enhance the power of central initiative and the ability to experiment at the periphery. Now, if you take the example of federalism, as in the United States or in Brazil, there would be two stages, I think, in which we could hope to increase the experimentalist potential of the federal regime. In its official doctrine, it's supposed to be experimentalist. That comes from the 18th century. The states are supposed to be laboratories of experimentation. But the dogmatic institutional framework of conventional federalism conspires against the tapping of this experimentalist potential. So the first stage would be to facilitate cooperation in the federation, because cooperation is needed for experimentation. And both horizontal cooperation among the states and among the towns, and vertical cooperation among the three levels of the federation. Then the second stage is to say that under certain conditions, a part of the country could apply to secede from the general rules in order to experiment in a different direction. Under the constraint that it could not use this right of secession, of deviation, to entrench some sectarian privilege of one group over others, or a situation of disadvantage of certain groups. So we have to be vetted politically by the political branches of government, and then be under judicial monitoring. And a set of doctrinal categories would be developed. But the basic idea is that we have an interest both in promoting the possibility of strong central initiative, so that politics is not enacted as each force's second best solutions, and this ability to deviate and create a counter-model of the national future. And there is no such necessary contradiction. There is a tension. But we can hope to have more of both. Now, at the limit, at the second stage, one of the greatest difficulties is for this right of deviation to be radicalized. The enjoyment of the right could not be uniform. In other words, we would have to allow certain states or certain municipalities to apply for a very wide right of deviation. Now, that happens historically by accident, not as a matter of institutional design. So, for example, China, one country, two systems, because of Hong Kong. They didn't design it that way, but they are benefited by having within the country a part of themselves that's able to organize itself in a different way. So that's the idea. And it's just one more example of how the experimentalist attitude, the epistemological interpretation of democracy, if you like, can and should be translated into detailed institutional innovations. Yes?
So when you said engage structure,
Engage?
when you said high energy democracy that is able to engage structure, what I hear is constitutional reform, right? And so, as within your model, do you see these nations that are experimentalist being much more open to constant constitutional reform, and that you?
No, it depends on each country. So so each of the innovations I mentioned is constitutional in some broad sense, whether or not it's in the constitution of a particular country. So the American Constitution, if we take that example, has two basic principles of design. It has a liberal principle of fragmentation of power, and it has a conservative principle of a slowing down of politics. That's Madison's scheme of checks and balances. The Americans think that these two principles are naturally and necessarily connected. They're not. They're connected by design. And it was part of the objective of the framers of the American Constitution to inhibit the political transformation of society, of the economic order. So you could radicalize the liberal principle but repudiate the conservative one by creating constitutional mechanisms for the rapid resolution of impasse. There's an impasse, break it quickly. Now, that's not where you would start in the United States. So if you made a hierarchy in the United States of what's accessible in the political agenda, what has to do with political mobilization, engagement, what has to do with hastening of politics through constitutional reform, and what has to do with the re-energizing of federalism, I think that it's very clear that first comes the re-energizing of the federal system. That's what's easiest to imagine in the United States. Then only second, the energizing of politics, money, media, and so forth. The American progressives have put that first, mistakenly, I think. And then only third, much less accessible, the transformation of the constitutional arrangements. Because in the United States, the Constitution is the object of a cult. Now, I just wouldn't want our discussion to focus solely on this political framework, because remember what the main theme is. The main theme is the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy as an example of structural change, influencing the primary distribution of advantage. Yes?
I don't know if this changes, goes back on the topic.
Yes.
I'm sorry. But I don't get the need for the high temperature politics. I understand the logic of central initiative. I understand the logic of the need for experimentation. But I don't get how the high temperature politics plays this. And in sight of like recent plebiscitarian logic in which like central initiative has been thwarted by popular whims, what's your take on this?
Well, I think the claim is that a politics rich in structural content is almost inevitably a high temperature politics. And the problem, which is dramatized by this phenomenon of Caesarism, is that we know high temperature politics almost only in this anti or extra institutional form. So we associate it with that. But the truth is that different political institutions differ crucially in the degree to which they arouse and support higher levels of popular engagement. So, I mean, take the United States again. The Americans are supposedly against high energy politics. It's supposedly a feature of their culture. But give me a rule of mandatory voting in the United States, as exists in many democracies. Give me a free access to the television and to the means of mass communication. Television can't be bought, as exists in many democracies. Give me a change in the electoral rules and regime, and I guarantee you that there will be an elevation of the level of popular engagement in politics in the United States. So the thing that is described as culture is in fact, to a large extent, an artifact of the legal arrangements.
Do you think that's compatible with a strong central initiative?
That what's compatible? The elevation of the temperature?
The elevation of plurality.
Absolutely, because I don't believe that there's a contradiction between the capacity for strong central initiative and this bubbling over in the society, a high level of engagement, and an ability to deviate and to create a dialectic. The more dialectic, the more it simmers. And the simmering is good, not bad. So it's not the idea of either authoritarian vanguardism or technocratic centrism, that you need a group of notables or dictators who keep the lid on society in order to preserve the momentum.
Maybe just come in here just
push you a little bit on some of these things. Now, after you described the three sets of requirements
Yes.
that would underpin the dissemination of the knowledge economy, you emphasized that that these requirements, taken as a whole, actually do not form what you call the system. That is, that they don't come in and take it or leave it basis, in their entirety.
Yes. But they are connected.
But they have connections, and I just want to
Yes.
probe this a little bit more. I suppose this is in part a response to a discussion we had last year, so I want to make that discussion explicit so that the import of that point
Yes.
is appreciated more. In response to a similar exposition last year, the concern I expressed was that this listing of requirements, and especially their interconnections, that the political component of it seemed to depend on the existence of the social and moral component, which in turn seemed to depend on the existence simultaneously of the educational component. That this created a kind of what you call a system, what I would have called a complementarity among all these elements that seemed very difficult to embark on a simultaneous basis. And in the absence of that, my complaint went that there was this very high risk that just trying to enter any one of these domains individually, say, let's make some progress on the educational dimension and the cognitive dimension while we're sort of holding back this path of uneven development. We proceed on one of these dimensions until we hit a constraint,
Yes.
and then we try to fix
Yes.
it. That was a strategy that was inherently flawed and unlikely to succeed because of that any progress on the educational cognitive dimension would in turn have required some progress on the social, moral, and the other and the political dimensions as well. That it created a kind of a chicken and egg situation that made it very difficult for me how you would actually make progress on it. And then your response now that you elaborated on today was that it's not like that there isn't this element, the system element, that there isn't this set of complementarity, that in some sense you can compartmentalize. Even though they remain connected, you can compartmentalize these. Presumably you would compartmentalize and then a kind of a sequence of moving, targeting one binding constraint to another, if you will.
I would use the language of sequence more than the language of compartment.
Sequence that you could design.
Compartments,
You could design a sequence that allowed you to move forward.
Yes.
Where ultimately you achieve all these different requirements, but at any point in the path, you're making more progress on one of these dimensions. You are lagging behind on the other.
Yeah.
And presumably the sequence that you would select is highly contextual. And I think in some of the answers you just gave, you indicated that that in the United States, for example, you would need to think about a particular sequence that is cognizant of what's politically achievable in the current context.
Yes.
Now, all of that is sort of general, so let's now try to move it in the context of the United States, where I think I understood you to say that in the United States, the path of least resistance to move into this set of requirements would be to try to foster more greater federal, energizing federal.
That's in response to the questions about the organization of politics.
That's on the political dimension.
Yeah, because that's what they were asking about. Yeah.
Right, but that's one of our requirements. So
Yeah.
This is kind of a little bit of a. This discussion is a bit of a fractal nature in the sense that that we have to find a point of entry. So if let's then pose a more concrete question. In the United States, what would be your point of entry?
Well, so there are many points of entry. So if you take this, I want to make now several remarks. many of the elements of that outline, the outline seems forbidding because everything is together.
Right.
And because I like to think and speak in these systematic terms, and that just sort of doubles the bet, as it were. Huh? But many of the elements of that outline have counterparts in present American experience. So, for example, almost all the governors in the United States have been trying to have their own Silicon Valley. It's a kind of, it's the primitive version of this project of disseminating the knowledge economy, like a Potemkin village that you sort of parachute in. Huh? It's just a misunderstanding of the root, but it's a beginning. So that doesn't work. So then what does work? And then you begin what I call this, for example, this first stage. Now, just let me give you a little bit of the list. So education.
I mean,
yeah.
since you gave an example,
Yeah.
so let's
Yeah.
go on
Okay.
an example. So I think because my general comment or question really will apply to each one of
Yes.
these. So you're right that there is always something on which you can build.
Yes.
And as you say, in the United States, the states in some sense are sort of labs of experimentation that something is happening. But as you say, it's not necessarily moving in the direction that will take these experiments in the direction.
Of course not.
So the broad question there is, what is there in the schema that's going to discipline this process?
So this relates to a second point, or to two other points. You do need to have a doctrine, a vision, a project in any kind of transformative practice, and to present what you do as a down payment on some larger endeavor. But up to now, we're talking in a disembodied fashion, as if we were dictators or the philosopher kings. And in the reality, there has to be a constituency, a group of interests, responding directly to your question of what will move this. Can't be just a doctrine, although a doctrine is indispensable. It has to be the formation of a coalition, of a set of alliances. So take in relation to this problem, this fact that in the United States, as in many of these societies, one of the residual growth strategies, other than easy money, is simply buying a few more years for declining mass production. So postpone the plant closing, perpetuate the air conditioner factory, bring them back from Mexico, and so forth. This has no future, and so it's then the confrontation with that problem of how you create a project then that involves the progressive politicians, the leaders of the workers, in an alliance with groups that they previously defined as adversaries, such as the small business class, to sustain this project of industrial conversion. So that's a central part of bringing reality and force to an alternative like this. It has to be translated into a real project married to real interests. But I also think that there's an independent intellectual element which comes from the history of thought. We have great difficulty in thinking about structural discontinuity and structural alternatives generally, because summarizing it in a nutshell, the situation is this. The classic European social theory, as in Marxism, was a doctrine about structures, and it said there's a closed menu of regimes in history. Each of them is an indivisible system, and there are laws of historical change governing the foreordained succession of these systems. Now, all of those assumptions are false, and they have become literally incredible, hard to believe. Although the vocabulary continues to be used, like the concept of capitalism itself. On the other hand, the tendency of the positive social sciences and of the policy discourse has been to abandon the conception of structural discontinuity altogether and to naturalize social life. So we have the structural imagination in a form that we can't credit, and then the forms of knowledge and discourse that are established are anti-structural or non-structural. So it creates a huge intellectual confusion in addition to the practical political difficulties.
And my concern is that confusion leaves the whole process not, non-convergent, and certainly, at high risk of moving in a direction that's very, very different from the one that we might anticipate. Again, my question is what disciplines this process? Now, I think the way what you're saying is that what's going to set, so the question of what sets this process into motion is different than the question of what disciplines. The question about what disciplines this is what ensures that it keeps on track in terms of the way that you describe it. Now, I can see that, some kind of doctrinal imagination married to a recombination of interests and new alliances can start moving us in this direction. But I just don't see what's going to discipline this process from from devolving into a path that might potentially leave us in worse off.
But nothing guarantees they won't do that.
The existing system has disciplines. You and I may not like those disciplines. So existing system guarantees that we stay within the neighborhood of where we are. Because we have a certain intellectual consensus that we're attacking, and we have an institutional setup, this setup of American politics that we don't like. That is the discipline that we have now.
So any alternative has to have safeguards also. It's not as if what I'm proposing is some dissolution of political plurality or civic guarantees. But that's always how proposals for transformation are read, right? I think so. So there's some things that are very elemental but need to be said. So the first is that the world is organized to reproduce itself. So it's a mystery how it ever changes, but it does change. And the second thing is Alfred North Whitehead's remark that the business of the future is to be dangerous. So that's what history is. So the presuppositions of the market order of the economic regime are not defined within the market. They're defined outside, in thought and in politics. So then what's the discipline? The discipline is the struggle that takes place simultaneously in thought and in politics. We don't say to ourselves, well, let's not struggle because we might lose. But we don't have that option. The struggle is going to happen anyway. What generally prevails in history is this path of least resistance, the way of changing, of innovating, of having the knowledge economy that least disturbs the ruling interest in the established preconceptions. Why do we think? Why do we struggle to create an alternative to the path of least resistance?
Well, yet the paradox is that in order to make your schema realistic, you have to envisage a path of least resistance too.
How so? What do you mean?
Well, you have to figure out a way moving forward.
Yes, absolutely. And so the path of least resistance is at hand. In this particular discussion, the path of least resistance is the insular and superficial form of the knowledge economy. And so if we're left with that, we have this insoluble dilemma of development that we discussed. The old formula doesn't work. The new formula is inaccessible. What are we going to do? That problem must have a solution. And the solution is to break this big task up into little pieces. And that's not just a programmatic task, that's also the task of the creation of a real social force, of a coalition of real interest. Yeah,
we have to stop here. I certainly agree about the need to break it up into smaller pieces and sequences. I'm just a lot less certain than you are that as you do that ultimately the schema that you've set up is the one that A, as a positive matter, we end up following, or B, as a normative matter, around the ought to be followed.
And what's the alternative?
The alternative is relative agnosticism in setting up and saying that, for example, starting out with Tony Atkinson's 15 principles and saying we start with the ones that are feasible, and we remain actually agnostic about what the next step is going to be. Because once we've done that, well, it's very hard to predict what the nature of education we really want should look like. And so it doesn't really make sense to really go into the details of whether the education system ought to be done.
That's just not how educational systems change. So in the United States, there's a changed educational system because John Dewey, the educational reformer, had radical ideas, which were a small part of this program that I described. And then the Americans organized a dualistic educational system. So they have one education for the aspirants to the professional business class, and they have another education for the rest. And it's no good for either their economy or their democracy.
My feet is not
You don't just follow him around all day.
What do you do?
I have a joint state and I'll read about what if we all fail. Yeah, tell it. Yeah. I'm up here.
Why are you comfortable?